Welcome to the explainer. You know, a lot of us have this feeling lately, right? A sense of disquiet, like the world is kind of coming apart at the seams. Well, it turns out history might just have an explanation for that feeling.
Okay, let's dive right in. Back in 2010, long before all the political turmoil of the last few years, a mathematical historian named Peter Turchin published this forecast in the journal Nature. And honestly, it's kind of spooky how accurate it turned out to be.
So, how did he do it? Was it some kind of crystal ball? Nope. The prediction wasn't based on guesswork, but on data. And on a pretty controversial idea that there might actually be a science to history. To really get how he made that prediction, we first have to understand the method behind it. And that brings us to a field he basically pioneered. Turchin calls his field Cliodynamics. Now, it sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. You take massive amounts of historical data and you model the rise and fall of civilizations, almost like a biologist would model an ecosystem, looking for these big, predictable waves of stability and, well, instability. And I love this analogy he uses to explain it. He says it's like forestry science, right? You can't predict the exact lightning strike that's going to start a fire, but you can see all the dry, dead wood piling up on the forest floor. And you just know that a massive fire is becoming almost inevitable. That's what cliodynamics tries to do for human societies.
So what is this deadwood? What are these social pressures he's talking about? Well, Turchin's model points to two powerful engines that really drive societies toward a breaking point.
First up, you've got what he calls the wealth pump. And this is a really powerful idea. It's basically any structure in a society that systematically funnels wealth from the bottom and the middle straight up to the top. In medieval times, it was simple coercion. Today, it's way more subtle. It's wrapped up in financial policy and wages that just haven't kept up. And this chart just illustrates it perfectly. This is the modern wealth pump in action. I mean, look at this. Since the late 1970s, American worker productivity has gone through the roof. People are creating way more value, but their real wages, flat. They barely budged. So you have to ask, where did all that extra value go? Well, it got pumped upwards.
And this leads directly to what Turchin calls popular immiseration. But here's the key. This isn't just about money. It's a much bigger, more holistic idea than that.
It's this broad decline in overall well-being for the majority of people. And you can see it in the hard data. Stagnating wages, of course, but also rising debt, declining life expectancy, and what economists have grimly called deaths of despair. Suicides, drug overdoses. It's that gut feeling that the system just isn't working for most people anymore.
Okay, so that's engine number one. The second engine driving us towards unrest is what he calls elite overproduction. And this is what happens when a society starts cranking out way more ambitious, highly credentialed people than it can actually absorb into positions of power. Think of it like a really high-stakes game of musical chairs. Society keeps adding more and more players, more graduates with law degrees, PhDs, MBAs, but the number of chairs, those top jobs in government, law, and business, stays pretty much the same. You can see where this is going, right? A lot of very smart people are going to be left without a seat when the music stops. And here is where it gets really dangerous. The people left standing, they aren't just anybody. They're often brilliant, highly skilled, and now really frustrated. They become what Turchin calls counter-elites. Think about historical figures like Robespierre or Lenin. Both were trained as lawyers, but they were blocked from power within the system. So what did they do? They decided to try and tear the whole system down. So all of this might sound like just interesting ancient history, but the whole point of Turchin's model is that these patterns are visible right now, all across the globe. In the US, you can see both engines running at full throttle. Over the last 40 years, the number of decamillionaires has exploded by tenfold. At the exact same time, the country is producing this massive surplus of lawyers and PhDs who are facing pretty dim job prospects. Head north, and Canada is facing what its own central bank has called an economic emergency. They have the most educated workforce in the G7, which sounds great, but there's this huge mismatch between graduate skills and the jobs that are actually available. It's pushed youth unemployment to its highest point in over a decade. Over in China, you've got an incredibly intense exam system creating widespread disillusionment among young people as millions compete for a tiny number of elite government jobs. And historians see some chilling echoes of the 19th century when similar pressures helped fuel the devastating Taiping Rebellion. And in the UK, this idea of elite overproduction helps explain a key paradox of Brexit. The movement wasn't just fueled by traditional working-class voters. It was also powered by a whole group of highly educated, indebted, and underemployed people who felt the credentials they'd worked so hard for just hadn't paid off. So if history is any guide, this combination of popular misery and frustrated elites fighting each other is a recipe for disaster. Which leads to the big question: how does this end? Well, the historical data is pretty sobering. In 75% of the cases that Turchin's team studied, these periods of intense social pressure end in civil war, revolution, or the state just collapsing. Peaceful reform? Well, it's the very rare exception. So historically, you've really only had two paths. The most common is violent collapse, where the elites are overthrown and society resets through chaos. Peaceful exits, like America's Progressive Era and the New Deal, have only happened when the ruling class got, as he puts it, frightened enough to reform the system, to basically rein in the wealth pump before the whole thing blew up. So the historical options are pretty stark: violent collapse or rare top-down reform. But what if today's technology offers a third path? Some people are arguing there might be a new kind of pressure valve, a type of exit that simply didn't exist in previous historical cycles. And this brings us to an idea some technologists call the technological exit. The core concept here isn't to fix or fight over the old systems, it's to exit them entirely. The theory is that you can use new tools like blockchain to build new voluntary social structures from the ground up, sometimes called network states. Think of it as creating a governance antibody, a system designed from the start to be transparent and resistant to the corruption and zero-sum conflicts Turchin's model describes. The goal isn't to win the old, broken game of musical chairs, it's to leave that game behind and start a new one with clear opt-in rules. So we're left at a crossroads. We can see the historical forces at play, the dead wood piling high. The big question is no longer if change is coming, but what shape that change is going to take. Will we just repeat the patterns of the past, or will we find a new way to break? But what if that's not the whole story? What if the real danger to a society comes not from the bottom of the pyramid, but from a brutal battle raging at the very top? Well, that's the revolution paradox. I mean, think about it. When you picture the big upheavals in history, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, even the American Civil War, you probably picture starving crowds with pitchforks. But the data? Well, the data tells a much different story. It points to a hidden dynamic that can actually predict these periods of turmoil with kind of unsettling accuracy. So here's the wild idea we're digging into today. Revolutions aren't really driven by popular misery alone. I mean, sure, that widespread discontent is absolutely the fuel, but the spark almost always comes from a totally different group, a surplus of angry, educated, and ambitious people who feel like they've been cheated out of their rightful place in society. Okay, so if it's not the masses, then who are these revolutionaries? Well, historian Peter Turchin has a name for them: counter-elites. And to really get who they are, we first need to understand the social pressure cooker that creates them in the first place. This right here is the core concept: elite overproduction. It's what happens when a society's education system and its economy start cranking out huge numbers of people with the degrees, the wealth, and the burning ambition to join the ruling class, but there just aren't enough seats at the table for all of them. The absolute best way to think about this is like a giant game of musical chairs. At first, it's competitive, but it's pretty stable. But what happens when the number of players doubles, then triples, but the number of chairs stays exactly the same? The game gets chaotic, right? It gets vicious. And the losers, well, they aren't just disappointed. They're furious. They start to think the whole game is rigged, and maybe it's time to just smash the chairs and burn the whole thing down. And listen, this isn't just some abstract theory. History is absolutely littered with examples. Robespierre, Lenin, Castro. What do they have in common? They were all trained as lawyers, which was a classic path into the elite. They were literally trained for power, but the existing regime blocked their way. So what did they do? They harnessed all that popular anger to build a new regime, with themselves at the top. This pattern is just shockingly consistent. So what creates this incredibly dangerous game of musical chairs to begin with? It's not just some random accident. According to the data, it's the result of a very specific economic engine that's been running silently in the background for decades, building up pressure until the whole thing is ready to blow. It's called the wealth pump. Think of it as any system that makes sure the benefits of economic growth flow upwards, enriching the elites at the expense of pretty much everyone else. Back in the day, it might have been landlords squeezing peasants for more crops. Today, it just looks a little different. And here's why this is so dangerous. The wealth pump creates two crises at the exact same time. On one side, you get what's called popular immiseration. Basically, life gets worse for regular people, even if the economy as a whole seems to be growing. You see this with wages that don't go anywhere, and even life expectancy going down. But at the same time, all that wealth getting pumped to the top creates more rich people, and more of their kids who want to be elites, which makes that game of musical chairs even more intense. You can see this wealth pump in action so clearly, especially in the US. Look at this chart. Since the 1970s, worker productivity has just shot up. People are creating way more value. Logically, their wages should have followed, right? But they didn't. They just flatlined. That huge gap between the value workers are creating and the money they're actually taking home, yeah, that's the wealth pump, diverting all that cash straight to the top. But here's the thing, this is not a new story. By crunching huge amounts of historical data, we can see this exact same pattern, rising inequality, this elite overproduction, and then, eventually, crisis, repeating itself over and over again across different centuries and different civilizations. This new field of study is called Cliodynamics. It's all about treating history less like a series of random stories and more like a science with predictable forces. By tracking things like wages, health, and the number of rich people, it can actually forecast when a society is heading into a danger zone. And get this, back in 2010, Turchin used this exact model to predict that the 2020s would be a decade of major political instability. And when you lay out the comparisons to past crises, it's downright chilling. The very same dynamics that were brewing before the civil wars that ripped apart the Roman Republic and the United States, that combination of high popular misery and a ton of angry elites fighting over scraps, well, those same warning lights are flashing bright red in several Western countries today. The patterns are just eerily similar. And let's be clear, this is not just an American problem. The data shows these pressures are incredibly high all across the English-speaking world. The UK, Canada, Australia, they're all seeing similar trends. A huge gap is growing between the number of highly educated young people and the number of high-status jobs available for them. A number like this really makes it all concrete, doesn't it? Canada has one of the most educated populations on Earth. Yet, by late 2024, its youth unemployment rate hit 14.5%. The Bank of Canada itself called it an economic emergency. This is a textbook symptom of elite overproduction, a whole generation of smart, highly trained people who are stuck in dead-end jobs or have no job at all. So, this brings us to the really big question. If a society is deep in one of these crisis periods, is collapse just inevitable? Well, history shows there are two ways out, but one is far, far more common than the other. The historical odds are, frankly, terrifying. Turchin's research shows that 3 out of every 4 times a society has gotten to this point, the result has been catastrophic internal violence. State collapse, revolution, or civil war, that is the default outcome. So societies find themselves at a fork in the road. The path to collapse, well, that's the path of least resistance. It's what usually happens. The other path, peaceful reform, is exceptionally rare. It takes this incredible moment of clarity and collective action from the ruling class itself. We saw it during the New Deal in the US, when elites, terrified of a full-blown revolution, passed huge reforms to rebalance the whole system.
So what it all boils down to is this. For a peaceful way out, the elites have to choose to act against their own immediate financial interests, to save the system in the long run. They have to willingly agree to shut down the wealth pump. That means things like letting wages rise, redistributing wealth, creating more top-tier jobs. It's such a radical act of self-preservation through sacrifice, it's actually been called a form of class suicide.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? The data shows us where we are, and history shows us where this path usually leads. Peaceful reform has happened before, but it takes a level of foresight and courage that is incredibly rare. The patterns are clear, the pressures are building, and the choice really rests with those who have the most to lose.